All right, welcome to the second installment of my ponderings on the new format and how I adapted my decks to what is necessary in the new environment that we probably face. And this one is a big one. It's about DNT, a deck that some have dubbed the new best deck in the format, and that definitely has um, increased its potential significantly with the addition of several new very powerful cards into the fold over the course of the last year. Um, it's definitely the prime phase of the initiative and has become a pretty significant player in the format. And I dubbed this video "Accepting Failure and Moving On," which is a little bit of a concession to just the knowledge of other people and the fact that at some point you have to realize if there's a lesson in this video, then at some point you have to realize that other people know more about certain decks than you do, and you can't really extrapolate from your knowledge of the format too much on every single archetype. So basically, what I'm saying is that I have been failing to build D&D for at least 7 years. Um, a mono white aggressive deck was like the second deck I ever built in this format. Or let's say the second serious deck I built in this format. Um, and over the years, I have been putting it a little bit on the sidelines, of course. It was never my favorite deck to play. Um, but I kept working on it every now and then when I felt a little bit inspired to continue working on it. But over the years, yeah, I have tried and failed to do um, a lot of different stuff with White Weenie, and this is just my, you know, the cards depicted here is just a little bit, um, yeah, of my hall of shame, basically, of all the things that I tried out and probably stuck with for way too long, not realizing that, well, this was not what the deck wanted or what the deck needed, and definitely not what would lead me to an optimal build. Um, and the lessons I learned through this process, I think, now come to a head in in a meta where DNT is going to be a very significant force, and yeah, where definitely, yeah, I wouldn't say experimentation with the archetype isn't possible, but definitely you have to be more concise in what you put in the deck and what you probably shouldn't experiment with. So the first lesson, and this is probably the most significant one. I had this discussion many times, and I concede the point. Definitely on DNT's mana base. Um, that you probably can't go below 35 mana sources and still play this deck successfully. For years, I have tried to basically build the White Weenie DNT archetype, kind of similar to what I did with Mono Black. Like going as low as possible on lands and trying to play a fairly low resource game where I would um, try to only try to maximize on threats and try to minimize lands. This, I think, is not possible in white um, due to the nature of the color. Um, I think black has the advantage of having a lot more ways to cheat on mana. And so, yeah, this is basically my first lesson that I kind of ignored the requirements of White Weenie in this regard to, kind of put into action the things I learned from another deck, which, even though they obviously weren't applicable. So, why is it not possible to go below 35 mana sources? So, first, um, uh, well, there are several reasons, but first, the deck is still too reliant on 3 and 4 drops and very mana intensive abilities like Equip. So you really need um, all the mana you can get to um, adequately throw your spells out and, you know, construct a competitive game plan. You don't have many, or I don't know even know if you have any real viable cost reduction abilities uh, in white. You don't have delve, and even like the cards that have cost reduction built into them in white often have it, in the form of creatures. So you have to have material on the board before being able to cast your spells. A good example of that is that one card. I've forgotten the name, but the 6 mana 4/4 elephant with convoke that puts a +1/+1 counter on each creature you convoked it with. I think that card is mildly playable, but like that's the example of a cost reduction effect in mono white. You would get that card for free sometimes by tapping all of your creatures, but um, it's definitely not the same as like just delving away material from your graveyard, because the stuff that you put on the board, it has to stay there. Um, you have to still be able to use this material to actually power out a threat like that, and that's why yeah, you can't really cheat on lands the same way you can in other decks, because even the cost reduction you have available to you is not really viable without having already a bunch of material in play. There's also very few playable free spells. Obviously, there's Solitude, but after that, the list drops kind of rapidly into nothingness. You do have Force of Virtue, which I think is playable, although not always a very high impact card. The free aspect of that card is often a little bit dubious. Um, you also have Reverend Mantra, which I think is kind of fringe playable as well. It's basically a Brave the Elements effect um, for free. But apart from those, there's not really anything that you can just play for free. I have to say there has been a definite improvement in the efficiency of white removal spells. For a long time, you only had Swords and Path as your only 1 mana removal spells, really. But over the years, there have been more and more printed. So now you're not too reliant anymore on these clunky Oblivion Ring effects that cost like 2 or 3 mana, which is definitely a nice improvement. So there is definitely improvement there in terms of mana efficiency, but it's still not to an extent where you can go lower on your mana sources and really um, have that kind of approach in a white weenie strategy. The next big thing that, of course, also limits the applicability of going low on lands in this build is the fact that you have very few consistent sources of card flow or card selection, and those are mostly at higher mana value. So, what card draw engines you do have, like Palace Jailer, for instance, that's a 4-drop, and you can't really keep a 2-land hand in a deck with like 33 lands and expect to get to 4 mana to drop your 4-drop if you already have to have card draw to um, to get to those 4 mana anyway, because your land count is just too low otherwise. Here as well, there has been improvement. There's more and more white card draw being printed, also at lower converted mana cost, but I think we're still not at a density where that is enough to warrant going down on lands, especially since the white card draw is often conditional, so very dependent on what your opponent is doing. Um, if your opponent is able to pay extra mana for your Esper Sentinel all the time, it won't draw you any cards. So it's not a very reliable source of card draw in terms of being able to afford a few less lands. There's also very little ramp or tutors for lands, which can also uh, can also of course obstruct um, the ability to really accelerate fast. Um, Also, the main issue here is that those ramp spells or land tutors are also often very conditional, so they're often tied to you having less lands than your opponent. You can't really go um, yeah above your opponent's land count and still expect them to be reliable. So really, you have to just rely on your regular draw every turn to hit your land drops. And what that means is that um, you will have to have a higher count of lands period to even hit that threshold. Another issue I see with the D&T mana base is that colorless lands are still quite abundant in there. Um, and those colorless lands are a potential source of inconsistency. I do get why they are so frequently played in D&T. They obviously provide a large upside, and since flooding is a pretty big concern in a deck with so many lands and no effective way of getting rid of excess lands, you have to maximize the utility you get from your mana base itself to really utilize excess mana that you might have still lying around. Um, the problem, though, is that those colorless lands also are a source of inconsistency because they reduce your ability um, to double spell. They can be very awkward if drawn in multiples. I've seen many D&T draws where the D&T player was struggling to play um, their double white pips or to double spell because they just drew too many colorless sources. Also think a lot of D&T players go a little bit overboard on this. So I try to keep those colorless lands still to a minimum. Right now, I'm having 7.5, I would say, because the new land Mirex, it's a colorless land, but at least it taps for colored mana the turn it comes into play. So I count it as kind of like a half colorless land. But yeah, it's definitely a huge issue for the deck that is a source of inconsistency that is difficult to address with the current card pool. Then the second lesson, of course, is that sometimes it's better to rely on the advice of other people and not get too cute. Um, I tried to kind of differentiate myself from other D&T brewers in my local meta by going different routes and trying out different things that they maybe hadn't. And so, for instance, I included a Blink package in my D&T list for quite a while, which kind of awkward as well as it provides a lot of anti synergies with other cards that are arguably more powerful, um, and also kind of inconsistent because a Charming Prince, for example, won't do that much if you don't also have a decent blink target. And yeah, cards like Blade Splicer have kind of been outpaced by power creep pretty rapidly. Um, Another field where it's tempting to get cute is the Stoneforge package. Uh, Equipment has also been increasing in quality over the last few years, and you have more choices of good tutor targets for your Stoneforge Mystic. However, I think that there's a certain point where you're where it's getting a little bit overboard in cuteness. Shouldn't really you shouldn't really compromise card quality um, just to get like a cute additional Stoneforge target, because in 90% of the cases you won't tutor for that target anyway, and you just put a worse card into your deck um, just to make one of your good cards slightly better. So yeah, that's definitely a source of uh, errors that can come up when building D&T, and I would advise you to keep the Stoneforge Mystic package kind of slim, uh, and if you include additional equipment, make sure that they are good enough inclusions on their own. Something, for example, like Lion Sash is kind of a no-brainer as an additional equipment. Um, I'm also trying out the new equipment Glimmer Lens from the new set, which has the nice upside of just being a creature by itself, and it's hopefully a pretty good creature also because it can draw you extra cards for just 2 mana. So we'll see about that. But yeah, cards that have kind of narrow effects or that are just worse than uh, other existing equipment probably isn't worth it. Especially since equipment has an inherent downside of not uh, being all that flexible and being very mana intensive. So a card like Eater of Virtue, for example, that they've put up here on screen is inconsistent in a way that it's only good if you have a creature, of course, and it demands a continuous investment of mana to actually be good in the long run. Um, that's why, especially those equipment cards that don't come with tokens already attached, are a bit of a liability if you go too overboard with them. So The next big issue, and I think this is something that um, a lot of D&T players are also realizing more and more, is what I would call the hate bear problem. Um, because hate bears are a very significant part of the deck, of course. They're yeah, one of the primary ways for you to interact with your opponent, or more accurately, actually, to shut down interaction with your opponent and facilitate your game plan without being disrupted too much. Yet they can also be uh, an inherent source of inconsistency. Um, why is that? Because they pretty much all have a very high ceiling but a very low floor. So a card like Grand Abolisher, for example, can be absolutely bananas against the blue deck and win you the game just on its own. Or it can just be a grizzly bear if your opponent is just fine operating on sorcery speed. So there's this wide disparity of hate bears either breaking the game in your favor or just being random vanilla tutus. So yeah, we have this very inconsistent showing depending on the matchup. Um, you also have a lot of potential with hate bears to fall into anti synergies, um, because most hate bears are symmetrical. That means they affect you just as much as they do your opponent, and your deck is of course built to minimize that to a certain extent. Um, but hate bears can also hate on your own effects if you have a particularly awkward draw. For example, um, curving a Leonine Arbiter into a White Plume Adventurer, probably not the best idea, because that means you will not be able to tutor for your land that you will get from the initiative on turn 3. Or curving a Eidolon, or no, Spirit of the Labyrinth, that's what I mean, um, into a Palace Jailer, because then you don't draw an extra card for the Monarch. You know, these kinds of anti synergies can sometimes hinder you as well if you have an awkward draw. So you need to be cognizant of that and kind of find a way to work around that. The third issue is that among the specific effects that you can get from your hate bears, there's very little redundancy. Most hate bears are very unique in what they do, and often also very specific. I think the only hate effect that has a decent amount of redundancy is one, the Thalia hate effect of just taxing non-creature spells. That is fairly common. And the second one is hating on ETB effects. You can play a bunch of hate bears in that category, so we fine. There's not as much in terms of restricting card draw, um, or restricting the way like your creatures interact with your opponent's creatures. So you have to be cognizant of that, obviously, to yeah, make sure you get the most out of your hate bears. It's also not a good idea, I think, to just go for as wide as a variety of hate effects as you can, because at that point you're just limiting the way of, or the points of disruption your deck is actually good at, because in the end you will never draw the correct hate bear for the correct situation, or it will be very rare. um you can't really rely on any tutors to get you the one off you need in any kind of given situation, after all. So, what some players have done is to just reduce the number of hate bears in their deck, um, which I think is definitely a viable strategy. But I think it also depends on what hate bears you still keep in your deck. Um, and to that extent, I think it is not correct to run very specific hate effects. Especially with newer hate bear designs, I feel like they've kind of ran out of unique taxation effects in a way. And so we see these creatures that have a hate effect stapled onto them that is kind of narrow. Maybe hoses like 3 or 4 cards in your opponent's deck. Um, don't really have much synergy against the average deck, but only against very specific archetypes. And so I would recommend you to just stay away from stuff like this altogether. Um, it's not worth it to have your one-off hedge against the affinity deck in Kataki, for example, because you will pretty much never run into that deck and have your Kataki ready to go. That likelihood is very, very low. Uh, what you should do instead is go for effects that slow your opponent down, give you combat advantage, or hate on an aspect of the game that a lot of decks utilize. So, where you have kind of a hedge against as many decks as possible. Um, what are these effects? So, on the top of the list is definitely restricting your opponent's ability to cast spells. So here we would have modifying costs, so making your opponent's spells more expensive. You know, the classic Thalia effect. Um, Limiting the timing of spells. Uh, Cards like Grand Abolisher, for example, do that very well. You know, when your opponent is not able to cast spells in your turn, or are taxed for spells they cast in your turn. So you kind of limit the window of opportunity your opponent has. And also the third way this can be utilized is by limiting the number of spells your opponents can cast. Um, an example for this kind of effect is Archon of Emeria, or Ethersworn Canonist, that only allow your opponent to play one spell at a turn at a time. Keep in mind, a lot of these effects are symmetrical, so you have to be careful not to get hosed by your own effect sometimes, but that definitely is probably the best way of taxing your opponent. Just taking away their ability to cast their spells properly. Um, because in the end, every deck casts spells, and the more you can restrict your opponent's ability to cast their spells, the better you will probably fare in your hate effects. The second option is restricting mana development. Here we see especially the effects that make um, make lands enter the battlefield tapped being very potent. Um, Thalia and or Big Thalia, I should say, or the Archon of Emeria being, of course, right on top of the list. You could also maybe put this into the first category, because obviously mana development is also a significant portion in casting your spells. But I think this kind of deserves an additional category simply because it operates on a different axis, and it's probably still good even if your opponent doesn't necessarily cast spells. Um, The third option is restricting card draw. Sadly, there's only one real option for this category so far, which is Spirit of the Labyrinth. Um, Restricting tutoring, Leonin Arbiter, um, Avon Mind Sensor, all that kind of stuff. Um, Graveyard Hate is also something that you can run pretty much without restriction. Um, I've included Samurai of the Pale Curtain on here, but there's definitely other options that you can go for. And the last one is effects that protect your creatures or make your opponent's creatures worse. So basically, effects that help you out in combat or help you out against removal. I've included Imposing Sovereign and Selfless Spirit on this slide, but there's also like different options, of course, that you could go for. Interesting also, I've mentioned earlier that there's a little bit of a redundancy on Torpor Orb creatures, creatures that hose ETB effects. And those are definitely also, I think, a potent way of disrupting your opponent. Um, because, well, we live in a format with the initiative, with pitch elementals, with creature combos. So ETB effects definitely have significantly increased in potency. Um, but the problem with these effects is that they will also hose your own cards a lot of the time. You might be able to build your deck around that, but I think then you kind of cut yourself off from a lot of the power that lies in this archetype. Because you can't run Jailer, you can't run the initiative cards. All of those rely on ETB effects. You can't run Solitude. So, yeah. Um, be cognizant about that. And, yeah, you could maybe try out something like Hushwing Griff, but I wouldn't bet my money too much on it at this point in time. So, now after talking about the deck building aspects of this deck, I want to talk about kind of its place in the format. And I had some discussions recently with one very prominent D&T player from our local meta, who said he was very upset about the return of True Name Nemesis into the format, and the prospect that would have for D&T decks. Well, considering that True Name can definitely be a very annoying card for these kinds of aggressive creature decks, I think there's definitely more leeway these days than there was in the past in terms of what D&T can do against a resolved True Name Nemesis. So the first thing that comes to mind is obviously something like Council's Judgment as an answer. And I think you can definitely include that card again. I'm not a big fan of it because it's very clunky. But I think it's probably a necessity to have at least one out in your deck to deal with a True Name Nemesis that is getting out of hand. Apart from that, if you're just concerned about a roadblock on the other side of the table, I don't think True Name is inherently more more problematic than, let's say, a pro white creature, and you also have a pretty decent way of getting around it. You have a fair bit of flying creatures. You have something like Seasoned Dungeoneer and Mother of Runes effects that can sneak through a resolved Nemesis. I don't think it will be all that big of a deal. And obviously, Nemesis is a very good card against the initiative, but if it's going to attack you, I think there's no real chance of it ever racing you in a significant way. A 3/1 body for 3 is just not good enough anymore, especially since True Name will usually be played in decks that have less creatures than the D&T deck. So it will be an annoyance, that's for sure, but I don't think it will significantly weigh down the deck in a sense that it's now that it won't be a significant player of the format anymore. So here's the question though at the end. As I said earlier, some have proposed that D&T is now the best deck in the format, and I definitely want to share my opinion on that. So, first of all, of course, the standard answer here that best deck is kind of a fraud term to begin with, I think. It's very difficult to determine the best deck of the format, or at least a specific best deck, the number one, if you will. There's definitely decks that are, bigger players in the format, decks that have more potential to be at the top tier. But the sample size is generally too low, and small local metas don't really embody the full range of the format. So I would say in that regard, you can't really call any deck the best deck of the format with any amount of certainty. The second thing that's definitely also still true is that the deck has some very significant structural weaknesses, which cannot be fully addressed with the current card pool. I've talked about them earlier. The mana base relies a little too heavy on colorless lands. You have a significant chance of flooding out. You have no significant card flow abilities that keep your gas flowing with any kind of consistency. So these issues still persist. But speaking about the deck in in a sense of improvement, of course, it has been getting to a point where it's definitely a force to be reckoned with. And I could see larger tournaments that will take place in the future being definitely, well, maybe not dominated by the deck, but at least seeing a fairly large share of the meta being just D&T lists. And that's mainly because the overall card quality and consistency has increased incredibly over the last few years, and it's by far the best deck to utilize combat-based mechanics like initiative, monarch, and equipment that have a high potential to be powerful, but usually don't have that much space in other decks. So I think they shine in the mono white shell by far the most. Even other white decks that combine white with other colors are often not as well built around these mechanics as the mono white deck is. So that's my 2 cents on this issue. Do I think the D&T deck is one of the top tier decks in the format? I would say at this point in time, yes. Um, it's not an unbeatable deck. It's not a problematic deck, I think. It has its weaknesses. It has um, uh, draws that you can definitely exploit to make them stumble. So yeah, like in that sense, there's definitely room for improvement still, I would say. Um, Nevertheless, this will be a deck you will run into a lot in the future, and that will have a very significant, um, yeah, very significant chance of getting more top 8 finishes and even some tournament wins in the future. Um, so that's it for this video. As always, you can find my deck list for my D&T build in the description, and I hope you enjoyed and look forward for part 3.